I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. As the world has been working at great speed over the last decade to become more interconnected than ever before, how is the realm of education being impacted? And now, as we face an unimaginable and unprecedented crisis that is forcing us to rethink about our global systems, how will educational systems move forward? We're going to discuss this in greater detail in the show today. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Burga, who's an educationalist and author and the coordinator of Pak Turk Marif International Schools and Colleges. He joins us in our Islamabad studios. Also joining us today is Mr. Gilbert, who is an educational innovator, a speaker, and an author, and the founder of Independent Thinking Limited. He joins us from Wales. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Gilbert, let me begin with you and let's try to set the foundation for our discussion to follow. When we talk about the fact that all global systems have been working hard to become interconnected and to create a global market for sorts, how has that impacted the educational sector in the past decade in its progress and in its trajectory?
There's a sense that the education market generally was a little bit stuck in doing things the way they'd always done it. A bit like in your picture there, children sitting in rows, teacher leading from the front. It's a model that's been around for a long time, and it has its uses. And there's been a growing push in the UK, in England, shall we say, which Wales and Scotland work differently, but in England, coming from America, to be increasingly teacher-led, backed up by some of the research that they've chosen to focus on, where it's the teacher at the front, it's a direct transmission of knowledge and of facts has been the area of education that the government in England has focused on most. It's also the easiest aspect of education to measure and to monitor and to assess and to inspect. So there's all sorts of reasons why the push has been in that direction. And then you see that push going on globally elsewhere as well. But what it means is that the education system has just become a little bit stuck, if we're not careful, in one particular way of doing things. And I think what's happened in the last few months is that the growing understanding that there are more ways of doing things. What we say in our organisation, there's always another way. Is now the schools have started to realise that they have to and that they can work differently.
Right. Mr. Stay with me on that point, but I want to jump to Mr. Ozler and talk to him a little more about this international dynamic which has been developing over the years, and especially the need and the importance of cultural exchange when we talk about education and how the curriculum is developed. Mr. Ozler, now your own organization works in several countries across the world to try to achieve this. Tell us what the main vision and the aim of doing that is.
Yeah, Pak Turk Marif International Schools, working under the umbrella of Turkish Marif Foundation, is operating in Pakistan, but in the bigger organization, Turkish Marif Foundation is operating over 40 countries and serving to 40,000 students in 5 continents. And what is the idea in doing things, or what is the trend in the global educational sector? Actually, in order to understand this global trend in the educational sector, we have to go back to mid-1950s, because since those times, there has been a sea change in education, because the approaches, the philosophical framework has been changed from behaviorism to cognitive approaches, and now we are talking about the constructivist approaches today, which means a student-oriented classroom, and the teacher is more like facilitator right now rather than being the only authority in the classroom. And the main thing, the main dynamic that has been changed during this time was the relationship between the instructor and the learner. So I mean, the role of the learner and the instructor has been changed a lot so far. And the collaboration among learners and the importance of the discovery of the knowledge by the learner himself, and the importance of the contextual and the authentic learning has driven us to another educational approaches and the methodology.
Right. Mr. Ozler, now you mentioned a couple of words here, and I want to pick up on those. You talked about student-oriented classrooms and authentic learning, focusing on that word learning. We do know that according to reports by UNESCO, in the world, we have more students than ever enrolled in schools, but there is a learning gap. There is a struggle in trying to actually absorb the information that is given to them. How can that be improved, and what are you focusing on that in order to make sure that the learning which is done in the classrooms is in fact one that translates into something students can absorb and engage with at a deeper level?
Yeah, according to, I want to pinpoint one reality here. According to one peer survey conducted in 2017, after the Ebola pandemic in Africa, they have been informed us that the 17% of the students, the global strand of the students, 17% of them have never found any chance to submit or finalize their homeworks because of a lack of their computers and the digital literacy skills. And also the poverty between the nations or within any country creates this gap. And right now, especially after the corona pandemic, especially after this pandemic, and the educational institutions are looking for blended learning solutions that are bringing either traditional classroom facilities and online learning facilities together in order to reach more effectively and more easily to the students. And these solutions will be far more easier and cheaper for institutions, for governments, in order to break this gap between the generations and the nation, in the nation.
Mr. Ozler, that's a very interesting point you make there, and I'm going to take that to Mr. Gilbert and talk to him a little about the inequalities Mr. Ozler mentioned here. Mr. Gilbert, that's a fact that there exist various inequalities in various forms, whether it's class, race, ethnicity, whatever disadvantages that exist in the greater scheme of things. Now, education is supposed to be an equalizer. How far are we from that mission and that vision of making education an equalizer for all, especially when we talk about how such inequalities still prevent children from submitting their homework, from getting the basic learning from primary schooling?
Education should be an equalizer, and a lot of people claim that it is and that it can be, but you've also got built into the very systems of education, it's designed to not be an equalizer. I lived for a while in Chile, lived in Hong Kong. I'm currently based partly in Wales and partly in the Netherlands. And I've seen, and the Middle East, I've spent time there as well. And you see the way in which schools can be used to be the complete opposite of an equalizer. You get the independent schools, the wealthy schools, a lot of the international schools are designed to keep one group away from the other group. I saw that especially in Chile. A lot of the reforms that were planned in Chile, all they did was just make things worse. And what I see in England as well is this drive away from the constructivist approach that was mentioned by your other guest to a more didactic, teacher-led approach. It was put forward as a way of claiming that it would address social inequality, but it isn't. It's just everything stays the same. I wrote a book with a number of different contributors, both academic and from the real world, if you like, called The Working Class, and we were looking at trying to change the narrative that we need to have in education about equity, and the idea that it's about give everybody the level playing field and the same opportunity, the same computer, and good people will rise to the top academically. There's far more to it than that. We need a more intelligent conversation, including aspects around neuroscience, around the environment, around upbringing, around food and drink, around the air that we breathe. All of these factors are having an impact on children's ability to do well and to take the information on board. So it's more than just access to the technology and access to the learning. There's far more at stake here as well, and that includes. If you think in the UK, you've got over 50% of the prison population were excluded from school. So you've got issues around behaviour and discipline. You've got issues around having a conversation recently with technology with educators from around the world, and they were saying some of our children don't have electricity at home, let alone access to a computer. So there are many aspects about poverty and inequality that we need to address, not just access to education.
Right. Mr. Burga, Ozler is an educationalist and who is working extensively in this region of the world, in many developing regions of the world. And this point about this point that Mr. Ian Gilbert brings up, that we need to have a more intelligent conversation about the concept of equity when it comes to education. How do you think that's working in this part of the world?
Actually, I've been in Pakistan for more than 1.5 years. And what I have seen here is far more different than what has been told to us before we came here. So I mean, the global powers, or the powers that are driving the politics of the world are determining of the destinies of the nations, unfortunately. So when I arrived in Pakistan, I have seen a total different world, and I have seen the hospitality of the nation. But apart from that, when it comes to educational sector, there are many opportunities in the developing part of the world, because the first thing is the generations that are brought in these countries, especially in Pakistan, are going to developed countries in parentheses. So these generations, when they come back to their countries, will be the driving force for the infrastructure and for the development of the other fields as well. So you have, and these countries have such kind of opportunities on their in their schedules. So that's why it is very surprising to see that the population of the Pakistan is over 200 million, and the 70%, nearly 70% of the population lives in the rural area, and this population lacks many means of what you call the access to the internet, the connectivity to the digital world, and such kind of things. But even then, their desire to learn and their desire to discover and invent such kind of things is much more developed than the other countries that I experienced before.
Right. Mr. Ozler, now you mentioned the desire of many students to go abroad for international education, especially for higher education here. Now, bringing our conversation back to the idea of globalization and the skills that are needed to operate in the global realm. Do you think that school systems are working towards equipping students with that knowledge and with those skills so that they are ready for colleges and universities abroad?
Actually, they should be doing like this. They should be doing like this, and this is what they are meant to be, actually. But there are some obstacles in this. First of all, privatization in the educational area is a little bit a problem in developing world, because as the privatization of the educational institutions is increasing, then the desire for the profit, then the real need for the that is applicable to the generation of the country is changing rapidly, and the amalgamation of the so-called trendy words and trendy concepts in the educational framework is coming into existence, but the what you call the benefit of them cannot be seen in the near future. That's why, yes, there are many trends and there are many opportunities, but these should be driven in the most possible and the best possible cause of this generation and the country as well. So I mean, these institutions should be loyal to their culture and their countries and nation.
Right. Mr. Ian Gilbert, on that side, now we are in the midst, at least from what I take, a conversation about how we challenge traditional imperialist forms of knowledge while also maintaining that relatability, that compatibility with the international context, but making sure that children are equipped with regional knowledges. That same idea about learning and developing a curriculum that provides an opportunity to nurture both types of thinking and both types of learning. How complicated is that?
It's not that complicated to do. It depends on the curriculum that the schools want to follow, on the exams that they want to take. If the exams are international exams that are encouraging people to follow, in many ways, what often is a Western model of what's important in the world, whether it's literature or history or music, then you're encouraging young people to look away from their own places and look towards a more colonial, imperialist, as you say, a view of the world. But it doesn't have to be that way. Increasingly, and certainly the work that we're doing in the UK, we're encouraging schools to go outside, to look at their own places, not to just, if they're going to be talking about, I don't know, the Egyptians or the kings and queens, but to try and apply it and make it relevant and real in their own world, in their own environments. And it can be done, but it involves teachers realising that that is an important step that they need to do, and not just to get children to follow the curriculum to get the knowledge to pass the test, to move on. The question about things like social mobility, and that involves moving as well, based on this conversation, from country to country. We call that into question because we're saying, rather than saying where you're from is not as good as it could be, you need to go somewhere else, and we've done our job as educators. It's saying, to what extent can we work to make where you are now the best place possible, so that we all benefit from education, as opposed to that if you get educated, you then end up going to the larger cities or the more wealthy countries. Not that we would stop people from doing that, but there's got to be more to the purpose of education, just to get people to leave their communities and to go to centres in countries and around the world. You look at what's going on with the environment as well. We need to be looking at the environmental issues that we can address on our doorsteps. And Mohammed Yusuf, the guy who did from Bangladesh, I believe, who did the work around microloans, he talks about the need for education to create job creators rather than job seekers for young people. And that we look at the problems that it is, we look at the creativity in young people, and we put the two together. And when you start doing that, you realise that education has got the challenge not only in terms of schools and classrooms and technology, but actually in its very purpose. And especially when you get to higher education, we publish books as well. One of our books that came out recently is called Forget School, and it came out in advance of the current pandemic. But it's very relevant. It's just saying that there are ways and means now by which young people who aren't being serviced properly in the education system are just doing their own thing anyway. Whatever it is that they want to do, they're finding out for themselves. They're going on YouTube to find out skills. They're putting their wares on Instagram, and they're creating markets. They are being their own job seekers, being their own job creators. So that then challenges the whole idea that education is something you do, that is done to you, that is done elsewhere, that is about learning from other people.
That is such an interesting point. And Mr. Ozler, I'd love to hear your take on that as well. Creating educational systems which equip students to become job creators, especially for a changing world, one that is going to change dramatically after we emerge from this pandemic. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, this pandemic has affected all the countries when it started in China. And but unfortunately, the most disruption area was the educational sector, because by mid-March, nearly 90% of the students globally, they have been stranded in their houses. The number is near to 1.5 billion. So, in order to balance the inequality that we have discussed in the beginning of the show, in order to balance, all the educational sector has tried to come up with an idea to better balance the inequality. So, unfortunately, this pandemic is affecting the most socio-economically disadvantaged children and the families who are living in the poverty line. That's why it can be very well said that this pandemic has been affecting the socio-economic disadvantages, and the most disruption is to the education sector. And during this March, April and May, even if it has been called off and summer vacation, there is a concept for this. There is a framework to understand this loss in terms of the learner. Summer vacation loss. This can be called a summer vacation loss, especially in the quantitative field, subjects like in mathematics. So I mean, the educational sector, the educational institutions are trying to balance this gap by some additional and supplementary tools. And online education was one of these. Especially online, when we come to online education, in 2015, the sector, the cost of the sector was nearly $100 billion. I mean, the online education sector, distance facilities. But by 2025, it has been expected that it will reach to 300 billion, more than 300 billion. But by the rapid effect of this pandemic, it can be expected that this target will be reached far before that date. And we can discuss on these details if you would like to.
Right. On that point, it's a very interesting conversation, but we're going to have to continue it after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we talk about how educational systems across the world are evolving, and now given this unprecedented challenge, what is the way forward? We're in conversation with Mr. Burga Ozler, who's an educationalist and the coordinator for Pak Turk Marif International Schools and Colleges. He joins us from the Islamabad studios. Also joining us is Mr. Gilbert, who is an educational innovator, speaker, and author and founder of Independent Thinking, joins us from Wales. Also joining us now is Mr. Cornelius, who's a co-founder of the Amsterdam Center for Learning Analytics. He joins us from Amsterdam. Thank you so much, Mr. Cornelius, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, starting off from that very point, that we have been talking about inequalities, the things that needed to be recognized that were deficient in global educational systems before COVID-19. But now that we're smack in the middle of this pandemic, many things, many inequalities will now be exacerbated. How do you think, what do you think will be the main challenges coming out of this, especially for schools and universities?
Yes, well, thank you, first of all, for having me. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that, indeed, whereas the current situation tends to magnify all these issues regarding access to quality education, educational opportunities, equity in education, but by no means, of course, this is new. And I think these issues more structural and has been apparent for many decades. But now it's more top of mind, and people start to think about what the consequences are, and also in coming out of the pandemic, what we can do in order to avoid these emerging educational gaps larger. And what we learn from this situation when we're in the midst of this crisis is that we see that there are large discrepancies in terms of educational opportunities for students, in terms of arranging education from home, the level of support that students require, the means that they have at their disposal, the burden that's put on them in terms of their in terms of households, and what we hope to learn is how we can better accommodate students when they are, for example, not able to come to class or to a school or to the institution, such that the infrastructure that's now being put in place in a crisis situation will also be there more structurally for students, because there are a large group of students who have specific educational needs and preferences and that require additional support, also without in the absence of a pandemic situation. So I think the educational systems, they learn a lot, and they are pushed to learn a lot now in this situation. And let's hope we can harvest what we learn and implement that more structurally, going beyond this.
Right. Mr. Cornelius, one question about the quality of education. Of course, during this time, it is unrealistic to expect that the same level of quality of education can be given or be received. What is really important in terms of trying to give education right now, in your view? What is important for teachers to do, for institutions to do, for the students?
So when you think about the main risks that we're currently facing is that indeed schools and institutions they are putting a lot of effort in terms of making educational material available, and there are many possibilities now to also to create access to the materials. But the main concern that educators and institutions have now is to keep students on board and to keep them engaged and to make sure that they can actually focus on the work that has to be done, to make sure that they are still able to interact with peers, to have regular checks and meetings with their tutors or with their teachers. So I think it's with the engagement and to make sure that students remain committed to their educational program. We see large discrepancies there opening up between students who have a relatively comfortable situation, have better self-regulated learning skills. They have more opportunities to plan ahead and to manage their time, whereas students who are in situations, for them it's much more difficult to organize education in the current situation without the additional support provided, and we are very concerned that they will become disengaged and will drop out of the program prematurely.
Right. Those are such important points. And thank you so much, Mr. Ilya Cornelius, for joining us from Amsterdam, taking out the time to talk to us. Mr. Burga, Ozler, going to you and talking about that, even UNESCO highlights how nurturing social and emotional well-being of children and students at this time is essential. How do you think your institution is coping with that and doing that during this time, making sure that students still remain engaged with the content that they're learning, but also have a safe and emotional environment to excel with the given situation and how stressful it is?
When we talk about Pakistan, by mid-March, all schools were called off, and it has been announced by the government that the months of March, April, and May will be regarded as summer vacation. So there were two solutions for the educational institutions in Pakistan. Either you can call these 3 months as a summer vacation, and you can send your teachers, you can send your students and parents back home, and you are free and you are comfortable at your house. Or the second one is try to create one new tool in order to deliver the content, the knowledge, and the create the bond, again strengthening the bond between teacher, student, and the parent as well. So some of the institutions has opted for the second method. I mean, they have tried and they have tried their best to find the best possible solutions with the opportunities they have. But before going to that point, I think it is better to discuss the psychological context, psychological background of the effects of the corona pandemic, because yes, we daily and in all the countries globally, we are talking about the physical death toll of the corona pandemic, unfortunately, but also there is one psychological toll of this pandemic. First of all, the loss of predictability for the students and the loss of routine. These are very important for the learners. When you lose such kind of things, then the motivation and the learners' desire to create the bridges between the new and the previously learned items will be disappearing. And what I refer as the summer vacation loss is actually happening right now. So what was the solution? Actually, the second method, finding a way to deliver the content and the education, there were some challenges in front of the institutions. First of all, the orientation for the new normal is very hard. Actually, I want to give one personal example here. When it is time for us to upgrade from Windows XP to Windows 7, it was very hard for me because I was very loyal to my Windows XP. And I waited during 2-3 years for the upgrading. But then I adopted the new normal as Windows, the new Windows. Right now, what is happening is just this. because for teachers and for educational institutions, there are three basic things for the new solution. First of all, the online education, giving online education. First of all, teachers and the institution should have three basics. What are these? These are the technical knowledge, how to deliver the content and how to continue the educational services that you are doing. And the second thing is the pedagogical knowledge, how to deliver the content, in what scope and in what sequence. And the second one is the content knowledge, which is what and by which sequence to teach the things in the curriculum. So apart from introducing the new tools that are LMS or some teleconference tools for the distance education, you should also be bearing these three basics that are the mainstreams of this field. For example, when we talk about the online distance education facilities, there are three titles. Either you can give this distance education through online tools. The second one is the offline tools. If you go for online tools, there are asynchronous and synchronous solutions. If you go offline, there are also synchronous and asynchronous solutions. But in all these four titles, there are many disadvantages and advantages for the learners and the institutions as well. So it depends on the means of teaching, it depends on the role of the teacher that you want to put him in, or it depends on the content delivery method.
Right. Mr. Ian Gilbert, that very point about the role of the teacher in all of this, and as you mentioned before, you wrote a lot of publications about the need for a classroom and why we need teachers if we have Google. All of those things, what do you think needs to be learned out of this situation about how teacher and student engagement needs to change, if there are any lessons to be learned from how it's being adopted right now?
I think there are many lessons to be learned. The book you're referring to, I wrote, Why Do I Need a Teacher When I've Got Google? And there are good answers to that question, but for the good teachers. And we've been moving in this direction for a while anyway, and we've been nudged strongly by the pandemic. To what extent is the role of can the role of the teacher in the classroom be taken over by technology? We're already talking about, and there are already examples of robots in the classroom. The example I gave in the book title is Google, but there's Siri in the classroom. To what extent can, rather than me learning from the teacher, I can just ask Siri the question? So the answer to that, to the why do I need a teacher when I've got Google question, is if you are not a very good teacher, then I don't need you. And talking from personal experience, I know I was in a situation in Chile with my daughters at one of the schools there, and the school was awful. And I just took my girls out of school after about 4 months of battling with this school. And they learned more sitting around with their laptops on Khan Academy or BBC Bitesize or all the stuff that's available than they had at a bad school. But the other side of that coin is what good teachers do, what makes a good teacher in the 21st century, if we're saying there is a lot of the traditional teacher model that can be delivered using the technology. And this is where we start looking at things like Mr. Cornelius said about self-regulation. We start looking at things around well-being, around creativity, about knowing good knowledge from bad knowledge, because there's a lot of rubbish out there on the internet, helping children identify what is moving facts into knowledge and how to apply it, their creativity, their ability to work as a team, to be a leader, to be a follower, their ability to think for themselves, to be creative. To be outside, to look at the environment, to work to support the environment. There is so much that we need now from really good teachers, but there is a change from the teacher's job is to deliver the information that the child could get from elsewhere.
Do you think that the training of teachers is at par with all the things you mentioned are needed of a good teacher in the modern age? Because it's not just about a teacher's aspirations of wanting to do what they want to do, but the larger system at play. Do you think that is improving? There's
good teacher training and there's less good teacher training. There are models that get teachers into the classrooms very, very quickly because they have good degrees. Some of that works, some of it doesn't work. We need to have a conversation about what the purpose of education is in order to be able to know better how to train teachers. And at the moment, the purpose of education, the conversation seems to be it's about getting qualifications, it's about passing exams. And as soon as we move beyond that, into what is it that we really want young people to be able to do. And we look around and we look at inequality that we've mentioned, we look at the environmental issue. Global climate change is still going to be here when the pandemic goes, and that's a far bigger challenge for everybody around the world. So are we preparing young people who are going to address those sorts of challenges? And then the issue around well-being is a huge challenge, and was before, even in successful education systems. You look at, based on PISA results, which is just data, and you look at what's going on in Singapore and in Shanghai and in South Korea, and their PISA results might be great, but their child suicide rates are high as well.
Right.
So we need a bigger conversation about. We use this opportunity to have a bigger conversation about the purpose and the nature of education and how we will create systems and frameworks that best address that question, and also that are more inclusive. Our education system gets rid of a lot of people, and in many ways it was designed to do that. We get rid of those who aren't going to make it to university, and they can go off and do other things. But we're in a position now where we can have everybody being an active part of an education framework that is not about getting rid of people.
Right. Mr. Ozler, now I've been talking to a lot of mental health experts ever since this pandemic began, and everyone keeps emphasizing on the fact that we're underestimating how much of a toll this is going to take on us collectively as a society, as a nation, in different spheres of society. How do you think, emerging from this, schools need to build up in order to provide students with that emotional and psychological support which is needed to actually move towards quality learning, but also a good, safe environment?
Actually, there are many solutions for this. Let me explain what we have tried to implement it during this period. As I told you, by mid-March, it has been called off for Pakistan education system for all private and government sector. And by 30th March, Pak-Türk Marif schools and colleges has successfully started online facilities with asynchronous method. Why asynchronous? Because when you offer synchronous method, first of all the students that is getting this education should be having internet access in a limited time. So when you have such kind of problems in terms of students and parents, and when there is a challenge in terms of parents for the access to internet and the electronic items that is needed to foster this education, then you have to go for the asynchronous thing. And the lectures were recorded from grade 1 to 9th metric, and for the IG1 Cambridge as well. And during 5 weeks till first week of May, we have continued this process. And nearly 11,000 students of our school system has benefited from this. Some selected teachers recorded the lessons, but in the schools, more than 450 teachers have been given the necessary trainings for the use of the learning management system, one learning management system, and through this learning management system, recorded lessons, necessary follow-up procedure and the assignments, and even the assessment phase of the learning procedure has been taken till 8th of May. And right now it has been 1 month summer vacation for our students, and again in June, again we will be starting for the whole system, the same asynchronous and synchronous model.
Mr. Ozler, now also taking into the changing dynamic, the changing financial and economic landscape, and the toll it will take on families, how can institutions support those families, support students moving forward? Give us an instance of how your institution is working with that.
Before this period, we were supporting again, because we are a government institution and a non-profit organization. That means our revenues should be again spent in Pakistan, in this country as well, according to the MOU and according to the fulfillment of our institution to the Pakistani government. That's why right now 20% of our total revenue is allocated for the scholarships that is given on the merit-based and successful students. That's why we are going to rural areas, 200 kilometer perimeters of our purpose-built campuses in order to conduct scholarship exams, and accordingly we are selecting full scholarship students, and also we are giving them hostel facilities, and they are getting free education starting from 6th grade, 9th grade, 11th, and for the A levels as well. That's why in this scenario, our institution is very different, and also during this pandemic period where the families have been struck very hard by the economic crisis which is going globally right now, and accordingly with the local government's decisions, which is some kind of relaxations for the parents, we are also complying with them. But even if there is no government decision regarding the school fees and other facilities that schools are providing, we are giving for the months of corona pandemic, I mean the April and May, we are giving 20% relaxations for the school fees and for the whole country, without looking for the government decisions.
Right. Mr. Burga, Ozler, just one last question. Now, I put this specifically because the Turkish Marif Foundation has 300 schools over 50 countries. It has an extensive, a huge network. Moving forward, do you feel like there will be changes in the vision, and how will the school policies be changed and be reformed moving forward after we emerge from this pandemic?
Surely it will be changing because of all the realities that we have discussed during the program. Because the change is dire all the time, and all the challenges right now we are facing are driving us for a sudden change. And in the beginning, human organism has a tendency to resist against these kind of sudden changes. But gradually, in order not to face these kind of things happen, the common understanding of the whole world will be driving into the complete solution for such kind of things to happen in the future. That's why the destiny and the outline of the education will be changing very soon, and more dynamics will be going into the classroom environment in terms of teachers, in terms of students and parents as well.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Burga Ozler, for joining us in our Islamabad studios. Mr. Ian Gilbert for joining us from Wales. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.